The Young and the Restless Spoilers. Kyle had come to Los Angeles with a brittle hope tucked beneath his swagger, the idea that love could be rewritten, that a new choice might erase older betrayals and patch the raw edges of a life split between duty and desire. He had watched Audra from a distance at first, as people watch the sea at dawn, measuring, patient, pretending not to be trying to measure at all. Audra, by all appearances in this sun-streaked, unforgiving city, had remade herself with the kind of careful hands that disguise old scars. She kept her apartment tidy, answered when people called, attended events that mattered to the right people, smiled when the camera was pointed, and slipped between the cracks of other people's assumptions when no one was looking. To Kyle, who had grown up in a world where names were currency and past sins were used as weapons, Audra's apparent reinvention smelled of possibility. If she could be new, perhaps he could be new by association. Perhaps choosing her meant choosing a version of himself who could finally stop being haunted by the old games and become someone capable of genuine tenderness. But Kyle was not a man who liked unknowns under his feet. He liked to understand the machinery of a person before he made a bet on them. So he resolved that before he made his move, before he tried to rewrite his heart, he would know everything about Audra, every small, ugly, inconvenient truth that could be used to change the terms of his own life. What began as obsession with clarity quickly curdled into a private crusade. He hired detectives, checked records, canvassed neighborhoods, cross-referenced old acquaintances, and followed any whisper about her past until it either dissolved into nothing or yielded the small, stubborn facts he could build on. It was then that he learned the one person who could tell him more than anyone else in LA was not a private investigator, a disgruntled ex, or a tabloid editor, but Sienna. A longtime resident of the same neighborhood, someone who had known Audra in an older life that the city had tried to forget. Sienna had seen Audra stumble and rise, had been there when other people turned their faces away, and, crucially, she had an investment in Audra's fresh start. Their reunion, when it came, was arranged to look casual for the public eye, two neighbors exchanging polite smiles across a cafe table, two women grateful that a mutual acquaintance had managed to keep the worst of their shared history buried. In private, Sienna and Audra operated on a different economy, a tacit agreement to mute whatever could jeopardize the new life Audra was building, a bargain, perhaps, that secrecy was the price of survival. Sienna had her reasons to protect Audra. Maybe they were old favors repaid. Maybe they were loyalty to a friend who had once been there at a time of need. Maybe they were guilt. Whatever the motive, the arrangement was real. They would pretend not to know one another when the right people watched, exchange knowing looks when it was safe, and keep certain doors permanently closed. To the world they presented, Audra was a woman untethered to a messy past. In the darker rooms of memory, where small evidences accumulate into a life, Sienna was the keeper of explanations that could free Audra or damn her. Kyle, though, is not the sort of man who tolerates ambiguity. When the polite facade failed to satisfy him, he escalated. He convinced himself that a cold, direct confrontation would produce the truth he needed. He would not wait for leaks or the slow drip of other people's testimonies. Instead, on a night when Los Angeles slept under a linen of fog and the city's neon heartbeat slowed, Kyle slipped into Sienna's modest apartment with the single-mindedness of a man who believed he was rescuing his future. He broke in not as a thief seeking objects but as an interrogator seeking a confession. He carried a knife, a clean, stupid symbol of power. And a voice hardened by every disappointment that had taught him to demand rather than ask. There was no elaborate fight staged in those seconds. There was only the terror of intimacy turned violent, the moment when the private history between two women was suddenly lit by the orange flare of a threat. Kyle's demand was brutal in its simplicity. Tell me everything Sienna knows about Audra, or she will die. The sentence itself is stark and ugly, the kind of ultimatum that forces people to decide what they value most in less time than it takes to think. Sienna's first reaction is not melodrama but the practical, stubborn refusal of someone who has negotiated with pain before. She does not scream. She does not bargain in panic, but she begins to trade, trading not for her own life, but for Audra's. In those minutes, the roles that the city's gossip had forced upon them, the fallen friend, the quiet confidant, the secret partner in survival, are stripped back to bare bone, and the truth that Sienna had kept begins to breathe. What she reveals is neither simple nor clean. It is the layered truth of a woman who chose survival by making choices that would look damning when unpacked by a man who only wanted a reason to control. Sienna tells Kyle that Audra had not arrived in LA as an empty slate but as someone fleeing an arrangement that had been always more complicated than an affair or a youthful mistake. There had been a man, someone with reach and appetite for control, who had once entangled Audra in a scheme of protection and performance, promising safety in exchange for silence and compliance. Audra had agreed at first, thinking a bargain could buy freedom, only to discover that bargained silences become chains. Sienna confesses that Audra once took a stand that night had almost killed her. When the man pressed his advantage, Audra had reacted in a way that saved another life at the cost of her own reputation. She had covered, lied, taken blame, and arranged for the right people to forget in order to allow someone else to live. She had traded her name to bury a scandal that would have destroyed more than her, but the exchange left behind a record of choices that could be weaponized by anyone who wanted her past to be a present problem. This partial revelation might have satisfied a man who seeks only the raw bones of an explanation, but Kyle is not appeased by tragedy alone. He wants not only motive but leverage. He wants to know whether these past actions are the sort of thing that could surface and ruin the life he hopes to share with Audra. He demands names, dates, the ledger of sins, and Sienna, strained but resolute, gives him particulars in a cadence that suggests she has rehearsed the story 1,000 times for people who would listen compassionately. She tells him about Audra's early entanglement with a syndicate of influence, people who traffic in favors, not firearms, and how Audra's decision to cover something up came out of fear, not malice. She tells him of a child that Audra never claimed openly, of a letter stolen from a desk that had the power to prove complicity, of an unsigned check that paid off a single inconvenient witness. Every detail Sienna supplies is a small, awful thing that when strung together makes Audra look like a conspirator in the eyes of a man who believes reputation is prize and past mistakes are currency. Yet Sienna also insists, forcefully, almost pleadingly, that Audra's acts were those of a woman attempting to right a wrong, not to hide a crime. The heart of Sienna's confession, the thing she keeps drilling into Kyle with the weary patience of someone who has loved and lost and loved again, is that Audra's past is a shield as much as it is a vulnerability. The same evidence that could be used to destroy Audra could, if understood with nuance, be seen as proof of a moral calculus that chose protection over publicity. Remaining calm against the point of a blade, Sienna narrates the exact moment when Audra made her defining sacrifice. The night a man named in hushed tones forced an impossible decision upon her. A decision that culminated in a cover story arranged with the local police and an expense paid by someone quietly complicit. Audra had been convinced then that the only path to survival for the people she cared about was to disappear into a new identity and accept the stigma that would follow. Kyle hears this and for a moment, perhaps the first real moment of tenderness in his obsession, he imagines the other man's face, the lines of coercion, the way power can make victims out of the unwilling and criminals out of the protective. But obsession is stubborn and wants easier narratives. Either Audra is a saint or a sinner, and certainty is worth more to him than the ambiguous truth Sienna offers. So he pulls himself, as men do when they are accustomed to being the arbiter of consequences, toward a harsher verdict. He calculates that even an act of protection could be spun into a motive for future duplicitousness. He cannot abide unpredictability in the woman he wants to make back into his savior. Sienna, who has watched Audra rebuild from things that might have broken others, counters with a revelation meant to unseat Kyle's need for domination. She tells him that Audra did not become the person she is by cowardice but by choosing to carry other people's burdens so they would not be crushed. She tells him of the nights Audra sat up with a sick neighbor, of the time she paid for a doctor's bill with money from her own meager savings, of the small anonymous letters she slipped into a battered mailbox to keep a frightened woman's courage intact. These are the contretemps of a life, quiet acts that mean little to tabloids but everything to those close enough to notice. The line between savior and sinner, Sienna insists, is sometimes measured by whether a person is willing to take on shame so that others may survive. The knife trembles in Kyle's hand in that instant, not because his resolve wavers but because the man inside him briefly recognizes that decisions are rarely pure. Then, the narrative shifts once more. There is the gnawing practical truth that secrets kept out of mercy can become poison when exposed in the wrong context. If Kyle intends to love Audra, he must decide whether he will love the whole of her, the tenderness and the compromises, and accept the risk that the past may arrive unannounced. Or he can choose to weaponize it, to use the knowledge to bend her. As he hesitates, Sienna offers him the last piece of the puzzle he demanded. She reveals that there is one person from Audra's old life who still paces the edges of the city, resentful and watchful, someone whose small acts of malice could spill the past into the present if provoked. She does not name him outright but gives Kyle enough to understand that his invasion has already moved Audra's world a degree into danger. Audra, Sienna says, had been counting on anonymity and good luck. Kyle's intrusion has shifted the axis. At this moment, the drama becomes morally complicated in a way the simple blackmail never anticipated. Kyle has the choice to step back and to honor what he has learned, or to press forward and force Audra to prove whether she can survive the exposure he has invited. Sienna, exhausted and with a courage honed by long practice, makes one more appeal that is not only practical but human. If Kyle truly wants to love Audra, he must promise not to use the knowledge to hurt her, and he must be willing to stand with her in the face of whatever comes. The knife, ultimately, clatters to the floor not because Kyle has been disarmed but because something in him recognizes the precariousness of the claim he intends to stake. He has wanted certainty to remake his future, but certainty at the cost of someone else's ruin is a bitter currency, and the sight of Sienna's steady face, of the truth she has laid bare in soft, relentless terms, changes his calculus. He pockets the knowledge as if it were a dangerous thing, wieldable, yes, but now heavy with context, and leaves Sienna alive, with a promise that is ambiguous at best and possibly performative. He walks out into the LA night carrying not only the secrets he sought but also a new burden, the knowledge that the person he imagined he could claim without consequence is more complicated than his desire allows. Sienna, meanwhile, returns to her small apartment and waits for Audra to come home, knowing that a ripple has become a wave. She has told the truth to a man who may yet use it to destroy the person she loves, and she must prepare for the consequences. Audra will return to a life that now has a jagged edge. Kyle has the option to bind himself to her past and defend her, or to turn the information into leverage and remake her into a prize. The story does not end with a neat moral. Instead, it opens into questions. Will Kyle stand by his vow and prove that love can be chosen in full knowledge of the person he loves, or will he justify coercion in the name of self-preservation and ambition? Will Audra, when she learns of the breach, forgive the woman who protected her and the man who invaded their safety? And above all, will the ghost of Audra's past, the unnamed malice Sienna hinted at, surface now that the city's attention has shifted? The streets of Los Angeles, long used to people burying and resurfacing their mistakes, will watch to see who survives the unearthing, and those who remain will discover whether redemption can withstand scrutiny or whether survival requires a new kind of mercy, one that chooses truth without annihilation. If you want, I can now expand any of the threads above into a sequel scene. For example, a tense reunion scene where Audra discovers what happened and confronts Sienna and Kyle, written in the same long paragraph style, or I can write a continuation that focuses on the unnamed antagonist Sienna hinted at, the person who might weaponize the past. Which thread should I pick up next? In the trembling quiet of Sienna's apartment, the knife in Kyle's hand had long lost its threat, yet the room remained heavy with the echo of what he had done. Sienna stood in the half-shadow, her breath shallow but her composure frighteningly intact, as if she had expected this confrontation from the moment she agreed to keep Audra's secrets buried beneath Los Angeles's glittering deceit. The silence that followed was not peace, it was the fragile space between revelation and ruin. When Sienna finally spoke again, her words did not come as confession but as a weary unsealing of truths too heavy to carry alone. She told Kyle that the story of Audra was not one of innocence preserved or sin concealed. It was the story of a woman who once believed in love with all the reckless purity of youth, only to be betrayed by a man whose name now carried the power to destroy her all over again. That man was Noah. The name hung in the air like a blade of its own, cutting through Kyle's thoughts with quiet precision. Sienna's voice shook only slightly as she continued, her tone layered with bitterness and pity. She had known Audra before the city, before the masks and reinventions, when she was still raw, still radiant, and still foolish enough to believe that love from the Newman air could rewrite the circumstances of her birth. For a time, Audra and Noah had been inseparable, living on the kind of faith that only people who have never been truly hurt can afford. He had promised her a life, spoken of plans that danced somewhere between sincerity and fantasy, and she had followed him into that dream as if it were her last chance at belonging. But then came the truth. The Newman name, the weight of family expectation, the manipulation of elders who decided that a girl like Audra would never be good enough to sit at their table. When whispers reached Victor's ear, the inevitable pressure followed. Noah disappeared from Audra's life without warning or explanation, leaving her to face the consequences of their love alone. Sienna's eyes glistened as she described the day Audra realized she was pregnant, the shock that turned to terror, then to defiance. She had written letters to Noah that were never answered, left voicemails that were never returned, and finally understood that silence was not absence, it was rejection dressed in cruelty. The family that had once treated her like a passing amusement now treated her like a threat to be erased. When the child was born, Audra named him alone, raised him in shadows, and watched as the man who should have protected her moved on with his life as though she had never existed. That was the moment when something inside her died, Sienna said, and something harder took its place. Not evil, not madness, just resolve. She vowed that one day, the Newmans would feel the same helplessness she had felt when their power crushed her future. She would not use guns or poison or scandals, but patience, cunning, and the one thing they could never defend against, knowledge of their own sins. Over time, she had transformed her heartbreak into a plan. She studied law, business, and psychology, weaving herself into networks that intersected with the Newman empire, pretending to forgive while secretly mapping their weaknesses. And when the opportunity came to return, she did so with a smile so perfect it fooled even those who should have known better. Kyle listened, every muscle in his body tightening, because the woman he had been falling for was suddenly a stranger built from contradictions. A victim of betrayal and an architect of vengeance, a woman who carried both tragedy and danger in the same fragile breath. He wanted to reject what Sienna was saying, to claim it was jealousy or invention, but the precision of her story, the small details that matched Audra's evasive silences, told him otherwise. He remembered the way Audra's eyes would darken when Noah's name came up in conversation, the way she would steer talk towards safer subjects, and the way her laughter sometimes cracked when the past was too near. He had thought it was guilt or trauma, now he understood it was both. Sienna continued, her tone sharpening now, as though confessing was no longer enough, she wanted Kyle to see the moral shape of what Audra had become. She loved him, Sienna said quietly, but love does not excuse abandonment. When Noah left, Audra learned that in this world, power belongs to those who take it back. Kyle's heart pounded with the rhythm of revelation and disbelief. He imagined the life Audra had endured, the loneliness of motherhood, the cold nights spent holding a child who bore the face of the man who betrayed her, the grinding years of silence. How could anyone live through that without breaking? And yet, had she? Was her return to Genoa City, her sudden alliance with Victor's enemies, merely an act of revenge disguised as professional ambition? The thought curdled into fear. Because if Sienna was right, then everything Kyle had believed about Audra, the charm, the affection, the mystery, was part of a carefully calculated rebirth. But if Sienna was wrong, then Kyle was standing in a stranger's apartment, threatening an innocent woman over a misunderstanding born of his own paranoia. The ambiguity gnawed at him. He demanded proof, something tangible beyond Sienna's trembling recollection. And Sienna, perhaps recognizing the futility of holding back now, gave him what she had kept hidden all these years. An old photograph of Audra, pregnant and exhausted, standing outside a clinic with a hospital band still around her wrist. In the background, a Newman security vehicle could be faintly seen, its emblem blurred but unmistakable. That image, more than any confession, broke Kyle's certainty.